Archaeology is a truly interesting occupation that not only helps us understand our planet's history, but also unearths some unique and, in some cases, unimaginably valuable artifacts from bygone eras. But some of these discoveries, though historically valuable, are just downright creepy, and very often the backstories to these artifacts are just as mysterious and macabre as the find itself, as archaeologists often discover that ancient civilizations had some very unique belief systems and ideologies. Number 5. In 2002, a team of archaeologists uncovered a tomb in China, and upon opening it, they found that it contained the remains of a man called Yan Shiwei and his wife Lady Pei, who lived in the 7th century AD. A few other artifacts were found inside the tomb, including a mirror that contains a gold plaque, a set of ceramic figurines, and a set of blue stone tablets that contain some very interesting information on the relationship between Shiwei and Wu Zetian, China's first and only female emperor, who rose to power during the Tang dynasty. Wu Zetian was born in the year 624, and she was fortunate enough to undergo a good amount of schooling, something that would not have been available to many women of that era. But due to her education, she was soon noticed by the emperor at the time, a man named Taizong, who decided that she should serve as his concubine. Once she had settled in her new occupation, she used the education that she'd received to work her way up to becoming Taizong's assistant, which afforded her the opportunity to learn about China's political affairs, knowing all the while that if the emperor were to pass away, tradition held that she would be removed from service and sent to live in a convent. Then, in 649, her worst fears came true when the emperor became ill and eventually passed away. But she became friends with the new emperor, Taizong's son, who was named Gaozong, and he appointed her as his senior concubine. But Wu Zetian was an ambitious woman, and she continued to climb the ranks, eventually working her way up to the title of Empress Consort. Thanks to her education, Wu Zetian had achieved the highest possible rank that a woman could reach at the time, but she was far from done. Thanks to her high position, she became familiar with China's political issues, and she would eventually use her role of authority to bring changes to the country's policies and governance. Then, in 683, Gaozong passed away, leaving her to become Empress Regent, and although her son, Ruzong, was named the new emperor, she ran the country from the sidelines, and eventually she decided to take over, and in 690 she became the country's first female emperor, establishing the Zhou dynasty. But with her newfound power came many obstacles, including a rebellion staged against her by Duke Zhu Xingwei. And this is where Yan Shiwei, the man found inside the tomb, comes into the picture according to the tablets that were found alongside his remains. During this time, Shiwei was living in Jiangdu, where he was performing his military service, and he caught the eye of the Duke, who asked him to abandon his post in favor of joining his rebellion. But Shiwei was so dedicated to his post that he broke his own arm to show his loyalty to the emperor, though some scholars believe that this wasn't a literal fact, but rather a metaphorical statement. He fought valiantly and played his part in the Duke's defeat, earning him a promotion to magistrate. In his newfound role, Shiwei took on the task of tackling civil unrest that had broken out near Luoyang, a task that would have been made all the more difficult by the fact that some of the region's most influential families were involved. But thanks to his strict demeanor and unrelenting drive, he was successful in restoring civil order, and he soon became one of the emperor's most trusted officials, since he was clearly able to successfully undertake any task that he was given. He was soon promoted to senior official, and he was tasked with overseeing political matters in the capital, as well as the surrounding countryside. But before he could fully settle into his new position, a tale of betrayal from an unexpected source would derail everything that he had worked and fought for. Shiwei had a younger brother named Ziwei, who had an entirely different set of ideologies to those of his older sibling. Unfortunately, the tablets found in Shiwei's tomb are less than specific, but we know that Ziwei decided to rebel against the emperor, a decision that he would soon learn to regret. At the time, a policy existed in China that was known as collective punishment, that in this case dealt with treason against the emperor or empress. The policy stated that anyone who committed treason against the state would not only have their lives ended by execution, but the lives of their families would also be forfeit. And so Shi Wei was executed along with his brother, despite having served the emperor to the best of his abilities and beyond. His wife, Lady Pei, had already lost her life by this point, and so she was spared the ordeal of living through Ziwei's betrayal and her husband's execution. However, since Shi Wei was guilty of treason by association, he was denied a proper burial and his remains were buried in an unmarked grave, so that they could never be moved to a proper tomb. This would mean that Shi Wei and his family would also be dishonored in the afterlife, as an improper burial would shame his soul as well as his legacy. But this would change 6 years later, in the year 705, when Wu Zetian was removed from her position as emperor, and she would pass away from an illness not too long after, among rumors of corruption and treason on the part of her family. The Zhou dynasty that she created came to an end, and the previous Tang dynasty was reinstated. Along with this change came absolution for Shi Wei and his family, and the Tang dynasty ordered that a tomb be built especially for him and Lady Pei, which was the one that was unearthed in 2002. And so Shi Wei's years of dedication and service were not in vain after all, and his name, along with that of his family, was restored, ensuring that he would find peace in the afterlife, according to tradition at the time. Number 4. Anyone who's familiar with Arthurian legend knows of Merlin, though we often see him as a wizard that was capable of magical feats, while serving as an advisor to King Arthur during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Though it wasn't always certain, it's now generally accepted that Arthur, whose full name was Arthur Pendragon, really did exist, but not everyone believes that he served as the king of Britain, or that he undertook the many daring adventures that we've grown accustomed to. For example, William of Malmesbury, a monk that lived from 1090 to 1143, wrote that he believed Arthur was in fact real, but that his reputation had been greatly exaggerated by the fantastical stories that were being told at the time. To the contrary, Geoffrey of Monmouth's book entitled The History of the Kings of Britain, which was written and published in or around 1136, describes Arthur as a king who followed Christian ideologies, and who often accompanied his knights on chivalric quests after his father, King Uther Pendragon, passed away and he inherited the throne at just 15 years of age. In his tale, Arthur wastes no time in gathering his knights and setting off to fight the Saxons, who he would eventually defeat, and it also includes the first accounts of Merlin, who he claims was Arthur's educator and advisor. There are, however, many iterations of Merlin's character, and in some tales, he's seen as a helpful advisor, enchanter, and friend to the king, while in others he's portrayed as deceitful, and in some cases, downright evil. Merlin's legend began in Wales, where he was described as a madman that lived in the woods, and despite the fact that he had magical powers, he chose to live outside the boundaries of civilized society. But this changed when Monmouth's book was published, and King Arthur quickly became a revered character during the late medieval times. He would also go on to write a poem entitled Vita Merlini, which translates to The Life of Merlin, in 1150 or thereabout. This brings us to the works of the 12th and 13th century French authors, who further added to the tales of King Arthur and Merlin, the best known of these being the Vulgate cycle, which forms part of the Lancelot Grail cycle. Originally, the Vulgate cycle consisted of 3 tales, namely Lancelot, Quest for the Holy Grail, and Death of King Arthur. But other works were eventually added, including History of the Holy Grail and Vulgate Merlin. The latter was written as a derivative of Robert de Baron's work, which was simply called Merlin, and details Arthur's birth, his childhood education by Merlin, and the tale of Arthur pulling the famous Excalibur sword from the stone, after which Merlin passes away at the hands of the Lady of the Lake, who traps him in a tomb. There have been many iterations and adaptations to Merlin's story over the centuries, but in 2019, a man named Michael Richardson, who works at the University of Bristol's Special Collections Laboratory, made a discovery at the Bristol Central Laboratory that he could not have expected in a million years. While studying 4 books that were published between 1494 and 1502, Richardson noticed fragments of parchments that he didn't recognize, and to his surprise, they turned out to be the Vulgate cycle that hasn't been seen for a very long time since no one knew that they existed. Upon studying the fragments in more detail, Richardson, along with Leah Tether and Benjamin Pohl, found handwritten English text in the margins of the fragments, and hence they took it as proof that the fragments date from around the 14th century, making the discovery one of the oldest known Arthurian texts ever found. There's also speculation that the fragments were not just the work of a single individual, but two people working together. Scholars believe that the true author likely employed an apprentice who aided him in writing the tale. Even more surprising is the fact that these pages were almost completely destroyed, since they were used as binding material for other books by a UK bookshop in 1520. It would only be 108 years later, in 1628, that the pages became part of Bristol Public Library's collection, after Tobias Matthew, the Archbishop of York, donated his books to the library upon his passing. Some of the pages were found to be damaged to the point where the ink had faded too much to be read. But thanks to a mobile spectrometer that was developed by Professor Andy Beebe, the damaged pages could be captured and digitally processed, making it possible to read the text. Then came the exciting part, translating the text, and it was found that it contained a slightly different version of the Arthurian legend than we know. One of the first differences that was noted is an encounter between Merlin and Nimue. In the better-known version, Merlin makes advances towards Nimue, but she casts a spell that prevents him from doing so again. In later versions, Nimue casts the spell on a ring, and this ring keeps Merlin away. However, in the newly discovered text, the spell that she casts prevents any man, not just Merlin, from speaking to her. Another subtle difference that was found concerns the 4 different divisions of Arthur's army. In the tale told by the fragments, different soldiers are responsible for leading each of those divisions than those described in later texts. Lastly, in the tales we all know, King Claudas, who is Arthur's adversary, is wounded in battle, receiving an injury to one of his thighs. When the fragments were studied, however, it states that Claudas is indeed injured, but it does not specify what part of his body is affected. Interestingly, when the ink used on the fragments was studied under infrared lighting, it was found that it was carbon-based, most likely an ink called lampblack, which is made from soot. This shines away from the normal ink that would have been used at the time, which was instead made from gall nuts. The good news is that these fragments have now been published in a book called The Bristol Merlin, revealing the secrets of a medieval fragment, making it possible for any Arthurian fan to read this alternative version of the tale. Not only does this book contain the translation of the text found on the fragments, but it also includes full-page color images of the actual fragments, just as they were found by Richardson. The tale of King Arthur and his trusty advisor, Merlin, will forever be revered, and the discovery of these 13th century fragments will only continue to intrigue the minds of those who grew up hearing about Arthur and his exploits, whether they really existed or not. Number 3. It's very common for archaeologists to find figurines or statues when they're excavating the site of an ancient civilization, since these items often depicted deities that they worshipped, or represented a certain part of their culture that was thought to be of vital importance, such as fertility or bravery. But now and then, one of these statues is found to contain more than meets the eye, when a surprising item is discovered inside. This may be because the person who owned the statue wanted to hide the item from view, or because they thought it would be a good hiding place, and it was either forgotten or left behind after they passed away. An example of this is when a 645-year-old wooden statue of Buddha was found to contain one of the oldest banknotes that are known to exist. The discovery was made by Australian experts in 2016, and upon studying it further, they found it was very old indeed. The discovery was a fortunate one, since the wooden statue was on the verge of being sold at auction, and it's only in the days leading up to the sale that the note was found. The statue had belonged to 2 people previously, neither of which knew the existence of the banknote, which was removed and later sold separately at auction. By studying the writing on the note, they estimated that it was issued in 1371 in China. At the time, the owner of the note would have been entitled to receive their choice of either 1,000 copper coins or 1 ounce of silver. Another surprising discovery was made by Spanish historians inside an 18th century statue of Jesus that was displayed at the Church of Burgos. The statue was due for restoration, but no one could have predicted that it contained notes written in 1777 by a clergyman named Joaquin Minguez. In the notes, Minguez states that the creator of the statue was a man named Manuel Ball, who was known to provide similar statues to other cathedrals in the country at the time. The note further details the year's harvest, adding that they were able to harvest enough oats, barley, wheat, and rye, and that they had sufficient supplies of wine as well. Lastly, it noted that typhoid had been a problem at the time, but that they managed to pass the time by playing cards and ball games. The last bit of information stated that the reigning monarch at the time was King Carlos III, and after the notes were copied, the originals were sent to the Archbishop of Burgos, while the copies were placed back inside the statue. In a similar story, a 300-year-old statue of Jesus named Christ of Patience was being restored in Mexico in 2014, when restorers made a macabre discovery. When an X-ray was taken of the statue's head, they saw what looked like rows of teeth, which would have been unnecessary since the statue's mouth is closed. But upon further inspection, it was found that it did, in fact, contain real human teeth, something that is not unheard of in Mexico, since many statues contain either teeth or hair, whether they're from humans or animals. But in this case, no one could figure out who had placed the teeth in the statue. What makes the discovery even stranger is that the teeth were found to be in perfect condition after 300 years inside the wooden statue, and the only theory is that they were donated to the church by one of its parishioners after they passed away. Our last example is of a statue that was created in India, either in the 13th or 14th centuries. It was relocated to Bangkok in Thailand in 1801, and in 1935 it was moved to a temple where it was left outside since it was too large to fit inside the temple. But when it was due to be moved again in 1955, it was dropped and a few racks revealed that there was something hidden inside. The outer plaster was removed, and inside, an 18-karat gold statue was discovered. Historians believe that the outer statue was added to the gold one during the Burmese invasion in the 17th century, and it successfully hid the valuable artifact from their enemies. But the most surprising discovery of this type was made in 2014, when researchers from the Drents Museum in the Netherlands took a 12th century papier-mâché statue of a Chinese Buddha to the Meander Medical Center in Amersfoort to undergo a CT scan. This came about when the statue's owner decided to have it restored in 1996, but when the restorer took a close look at it, he discovered that 2 small pillows had been placed under the statue's knees, and when these were removed, he was shocked to discover that it contained human remains. Thanks to this discovery, researchers knew for some time that there were remains hidden inside the statue, but they could not have prepared for what the CT scan revealed: the actual full remains of a Buddhist monk. When further research was conducted on the text that was found with the remains, it was found that they likely belonged to a man named Lu Quan, a master of the Chinese meditation school who passed away in 1100. It's believed that Lu Quan underwent the process of self-mummification, during which a monk would refuse any food other than fruit, berries, nuts, and seeds for 1,000 days. And during this time, they would engage in strenuous exercise to rid themselves of all body fat. The next 1,000 days would be even harder, as their diet was restricted to roots and bark, while ingesting a type of tree sap that gradually dehydrates the body. Following all of this, they would lock themselves in a small chamber, where they would meditate until their passing. Fellow monks would listen for a bell that the encased monk would ring once a day, signaling that he's still alive. But if the bell didn't ring, they would know that he had passed away, and the chamber would be sealed for a further 1,000 days. When this period had passed, the chamber was opened, and if the monk was found to be mummified, they would be considered holy and exalted as a Buddha. If this is not the case, however, they would be resealed in the chamber, but they would not reach the status of Buddha. There's a belief among Buddhists that these monks who successfully mummify themselves have not passed away at all, but they are, in fact, in a state of meditation. Researchers believe that Lu Quan was on a display in a temple in China for around 200 years before his remains were encased in the statue. DNA samples have been collected from the mummy in hopes that we can learn where Lu Quan lived, though it's certain that he resided in China. The mummy was removed and put on display at the Drents Museum, where it formed part of an exhibition named Mummies: Life Beyond Death. Following this, it was moved to Budapest's Hungarian Natural History Museum, where it remains to this day. Number 2. Since the dawn of time, we've been fascinated by the night sky. And in many cultures, the stars and planets of our solar system have a greater meaning than just merely being heavenly bodies. Many people believe in astrology, where the different positions of planets and stars are interpreted to predict future events in someone's life according to their star sign and the stars that are contained within that zodiac. Some ancient cultures believed that they weren't actually stars, but divine entities that observed the earth from above, deciding the fates of people who worshipped them according to sacrifices that were made in their name. Very often, natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions were attributed to the anger of these entities, and failing crops would often be a sign that the sacrifices that were made were deemed unsatisfactory. Some cultures were more specific in their worship, as some only considered the moon to be influential in their lives, while others worshiped the sun or other planets instead of all the stars in the sky. It's no surprise then that people started attempting to map the universe from a very long time ago, one of which was a Greek astronomer by the name of Hipparchus, who lived between 190 and 120 BC. Hipparchus decided to create as accurate a map as possible of all the stars and planets that he was able to observe, and his efforts are well known. However, there is never any evidence that he completed his task, as his work in this regard was thought to have been lost over time. What was known was that Hipparchus's efforts would have resulted in the oldest known map of the stars, and that he was the first person to ever use two sets of coordinates to pin down the exact location of a single star. Hipparchus's efforts are mentioned in the works of Claudius Ptolemy, an ancient astronomer and mathematician who lived from 100 to 170 CE. Ptolemy also attempted to create his own map of the universe when he was around 50 years old, but his findings were not mentioned in these works. However, we do have a small piece of proof that he did indeed finish at least some of his work, since an 8th century poem about our constellations was found to contain stellar coordinates that are believed to have been calculated by Hipparchus. But this all changed thanks to a chance discovery that was made in 2012, when a document known as Codex Climaci Rescriptus was found to contain more than meets the eye. The Codex Climaci Rescriptus is a document that's made up of 292 pages, and thanks to carbon dating, we assume that these pages are either from the 5th or 6th century. They contain the writings of John Climacus, who served as the head of St. Catherine's Monastery at the Sinai during the 7th century. This would suggest a serious error in the dating, but it was found that the document contained earlier writings at one time that were erased to make way for someone else's work. With this information on hand, a University of Cambridge biblical historian by the name of Peter Williams decided to do a little further digging, and he instructed students from his class to study the pages closely as a summer project. This is when one of the students, Jamie Clare, found a piece of Greek writing that caught her attention. She noticed an excerpt that was thought to have been written by a different astronomer, who lived from 176 BC to 194 BC, and who is known to be the first person to calculate the size of the Earth. Realizing that the writings may be of importance, researchers decided to have the pages sent for multispectral imaging, since it's possible that the pages contained a lot more information than was previously thought. To reveal any hidden text, the pages were photographed in several different colors. Next, infrared and X-ray images were taken and combined with the color photographs, which then revealed pigment that had been left behind. Once this was done, the document was subjected to intense scrutiny, and that's when Williams noticed a set of stellar coordinates. When these coordinates were checked, they were found to point to the Corona Borealis constellation. Using this knowledge and modern techniques, researchers were able to work backwards and found that Hipparchus wrote the text in 129 BC, and that he was incredibly accurate in his findings. Coincidentally, researchers needed to account for a phenomenon known as precession during their investigation, in which the Earth wobbles as it rotates on its axis. And it was Hipparchus who discovered that the Earth tilts on its axis by 1 degree every 72 years. It's now believed that Hipparchus was the first person to attempt a map of the stars, and he would not have found it easy given the tools that he had at his disposal before telescopes were invented. It's thought that Hipparchus would have used an armillary sphere, which he is also thought to have invented to make his measurements to the heavens. The sphere contains a set of rings that rotate around a center sphere, and these are then used to calculate the exact positions of celestial bodies, such as the sun. Another piece of equipment that may have been available to him is the dioptra, which is an optical piece of equipment that's used to measure both altitudes and angles. It consists of a rod with openings at each end through which the user would look. Protractors that are fitted at the base are then used to calculate the positions of objects like stars, and it's thought it was also used throughout history as a surveying tool. It's believed that Hipparchus mapped around 800 stars during his studies, but not many of these have been discovered. One fact that is certain, though, is that he was more accurate in his measurements than any other astronomer who came after him, including Ptolemy, who's also revered as an astronomer. It's an exciting discovery indeed, but there's a good chance that we may learn even more about Hipparchus in the future, since only a small portion of his works have been discovered, and it's possible that many more will be found in the years to come. Number 1. One of the last places that anyone would anticipate making an archaeological discovery is inside their own home. But there have been many instances where people have happened upon strange discoveries while working on buildings, some of which were found to be quite valuable, while others are just downright strange. In 1653, a man named Adrian, who lived in Belgium, was hard at work at the Church of St. Brice when he happened upon a cache of gold coins. He continued digging, and to his surprise, he unearthed a tomb that had been buried beneath the building. The tomb was then opened and found to contain 100 more gold coins, a gold ring that was worn around the neck, swords that contained gold and jewels, 3,000 small golden bees, a golden bull's head, and a ring that contained the inscription Childerici Regis. It was later found to be the tomb of King Childeric I. This discovery had a horrific ending, though, as the treasure was stolen 200 years later and melted down, save for 2 of the bees, 2 coins, and the sword's fittings. One of the most important discoveries that was ever made in Egypt was that of the Rosetta Stone, which served as a key to deciphering the hieroglyphs that were found inside of tombs and other Egyptian buildings. The black stone contained writing not only in Greek, but also Demotic, which is a form of ancient Greek, and hieroglyphs, making it possible for researchers to compare the hieroglyphic symbols to a known language, though it took more than 2 decades for the code to be fully solved. Another of these chance discoveries was made in London in 1912, when construction workers were in the process of demolishing a building known as Wakefield House. As the workers broke through the floor of the house's cellar, they struck a wooden object, and upon retrieving it, they were shocked to find that it contained over 400 pieces of jewelry that were dated to the 16th and 17th centuries. This discovery could have also ended tragically, with the jewelry being lost forever, since the workers decided to keep everything they found, eventually selling it to a pawn shop. But luckily, the owner of the shop was the head of acquisitions for the London Museum, and the treasure was relocated to the museum, where it's still housed today. Many people would consider the Dead Sea Scrolls as the most important archaeological find ever made, but not many know that this was uncovered quite by accident, and by 3 unlikely people. The 3 men were shepherds who were looking for one of their goats that had wandered off. They tracked it to a cave near the Dead Sea, but this is where they made their unexpected discovery. Inside a set of clay jars, they found the papyrus scrolls that we now know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They then took the scrolls to Bethlehem, where they were sold to an antiquities dealer. The caves were found again in 1949, and it took another 10 years for the rest of the writings to be unearthed, and they were found to predate the oldest known Hebrew Bible text by more than a millennium. But the discovery that we'll be focusing on now is nowhere near as important as the Dead Sea Scrolls, or even a trove of jewels and gold, though its original owner would have considered it vital to their health and well-being. It all started when the owner of a house, which was formerly an inn, called the Star and Garter Inn, located in England, decided that the building's chimney needed to be removed, and so he employed a contracting company to complete the arduous task. But they could never have predicted that the work they started that day would end in witchcraft and protection spells. As the chimney was being demolished, the workers noticed something that should not have been there, and when they extracted it, they realized it was a strange bottle that contained some macabre items. Inside, they found a strange liquid that would later be identified as urine, a set of fishing hooks, pieces of broken glass, and most disconcerting of all, actual human teeth. But as much as this must have mystified the construction workers, it's not at all that uncommon to find one of these bottles, as more than 100 of these have been discovered in strange places all across Britain over the years. They've been found buried along rivers, hidden inside of old buildings, and even buried in churchyards. It would turn out that this was a 19th century witch bottle that was crafted by people at the time to protect themselves from witches and the spells that they were thought to be able to cast. Many of these bottles are much older, however, since Europe became obsessed with the existence of witches during the Burning Time, which lasted from 1400 to 1782. It was also during this time, specifically 1486, that two men, Jacob Springer and Henrik Kramer, wrote a book that served as a handbook on how witches and witchcraft could be identified, how to force a witch to confess, as well as how witchcraft could be eradicated. For 100 years between 1550 and 1650, panic concerning witchcraft reached a fever pitch. But this was exacerbated by the fact that people were being persecuted as witches, when they were, in fact, merely Protestants that were being targeted by Catholics and vice versa. The last execution of a witch in England took place in 1716, when Mary Hicks and her daughter Mary were found guilty. But many people were still being accused of witchcraft across Europe, and especially in Germany for the next few decades. It's understandable that people looked for any means by which they could stay safe from these alleged witches that were exposed on a near daily basis, a witch bottle being one of the more easily accessible and affordable options. As for why the bottle was placed inside a chimney, it's not just because it would make a good hiding spot, but it's thought that the people at the time believed a chimney would be one of the more easily accessible areas through which a witch or a spell could enter their homes, and the bottles would serve as a barrier against them. An explanation of the bottle's contents is as follows. As the witch descends down the chimney, they would become snagged on the pieces of broken glass. But it didn't necessarily have to contain glass, as other witch bottles were found to contain spiky items, such as thorns, bent needles, or nail clippings. The liquid that was found in these bottles is thought to represent the urinary problems that people were experiencing at the time, which were also attributed to witchcraft, though this is mere speculation. What makes the discovery of the witch bottles in the chimney all the more baffling, though, is the fact that it dates from much later, as the type of bottle that was found in this particular instance was manufactured in 1830. But there may be a very good reason for it being created and placed in the chimney, as the inn is known to be where Angeline Tubbs, who was known as the Witch of Saratoga, was born, and its inhabitants may have wanted to add additional security against her powers just in case. The owner of the building opted to not have the bottle destroyed, but instead decided to hide it in their house just as the previous owners had done. It isn't known whether this was done as a matter of caution or tradition, but it's likely that they'll sleep a little better knowing that it is there. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.